through ordination, but all of us do that through the witness of our lives and our service. Our gospel reading today comes from the Gospel of Luke. These are the lectionary readings that will be shared by congregations all over the United States today. And I'm always struck by how we read the same scriptures, but no doubt there will be thousands of different kinds of sermons preached today. So it is a joy for me to be with you as we look at these texts from Joel and Luke and look on this Reformation Sunday what it means to be the church reformed, ever reforming. So from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 and following. And Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like that tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all my income." But, continued Jesus, the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look heavenward, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this very man, this tax collector, went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The word of the Lord. So maybe you've heard the joke, how many Presbyterians does it take to change a light bulb? Wait, don't change that light bulb. My grandmother donated that light bulb. Change in the church. We're living in times of incredible change. Change in our culture. Change that is happening out beyond the walls of sanctuaries that also then come and affect life within a sanctuary. A great teacher, theologian, Phyllis Tickle, said, about every 500 years, the church cleans out its attic and has a giant rummage sale. And if you look back at our church history over the last 2,000 years, about every 500 years, we've had some cataclysmic event that changed the face of the church dramatically. And yet, why is it that we so fear change? Why is it that we often feel so daunted by change or by the challenges of our times and the challenges then that we experience within the church? I'd like you to think for a moment about some of the changes you have seen in your lifetime, both beyond the walls of the church and within. What are some of the changes you have witnessed? And you can feel free to just shout a few out if you would. Walking on the moon. Can you imagine Christians in previous generations ever imagining that far distant orb humans would actually be able to walk upon? Even that very fact that we've walked on the moon changes our understanding of the heavens and where God is and our understanding of human power and capability. Other communication. One of the big communication changes actually happened that gave way to the Reformation, which was the development of the printing press. And once the printing press was developed, they could actually print Bibles for the first time. People could read Scripture in their own language rather than have it interpreted through a priest. And that helped lead to the Reformation. And now we're living through a time where that form of communication has so changed. Who here has a computer? Who here has a cell phone? Not everyone in the world does, not everyone sitting here does, but those technologies have dramatically changed the way we communicate, the way information is shared, the amount of information we get on a daily basis. Other things. LGBTQ inclusion in the church. Think how many decades We spun our wheels round and round, fighting over something, only to finally allow the Spirit to shine into our churches and into our hearts and remind us that God makes us the way we are. And I don't know the journey your church has had, but almost every congregation I am with has had to take a journey, because there was a time when we were told that was sin. And thank God we continue to be a church reforming, allowing the fresh winds of the Spirit to blow through our hearts and our institutions, coaxing us up into new realizations of who we are as the church and who the church is called to be. Some of the changes we experience come with great joy and welcome. Some of them we greet with great resistance. I will confess, the little rural church I grew up in, my father was a minister, loved that church. Years later, I went back, and it was one of the first churches I'd ever seen that had a screen. I have to tell you, I was not a fan. I thought, wait, I can't see that beautiful front of the church. They put screens up there, and I was caught up by my own being wed to a certain way that the space was supposed to look, or certain ways we were supposed to worship. And I've had many times in my life where, whether it's changes out there or changes taking place within the church, sometimes those were changes I welcomed, and I saw the gift that they brought. And there are times I thought, how much does a person have to change in a lifetime? But we are living in a time when many of the institutions that we grew up with, many of the ways we even understood the role of church in society has dramatically shifted. In the 50s, probably this congregation and most in this area were filled to the brim because part of the culture supported being present in church. The role of the mainline churches in society was very different. Clergy actually had a voice in the larger community. I remember back when my father was new in ministry and there was something going on in the community, the clergy were called together to weigh in on what should happen. Well, the clergy now tend to be some of the last that get called, certainly by political or community leaders. And yet the importance of the church has not changed. But change continues to happen to us. And we need to be reminded at such times that it is the way that God does a new thing in the world. The prophets speak of God doing a new thing. Even the prophet Joel, as we read today, he is speaking to a people who have been through so much. They have experienced being captive. They have experienced turning away from God. They have experienced dire times that made them wonder, God, are you really our God, and are we really your people? And in this passage, we are not only reminded that God promises to care for them, to make sure all of their needs are met, and that God also invites them into a season, a way of life, of dreaming and re-envisioning who they were to be as God's people. A time for dreaming dreams and having visions has come upon us again as the church, brothers and sisters. I can't imagine the reformers of 500 years ago, how much courage they needed to break with the church as they knew it. The Reformation that birthed the Presbyterian Church, the Protestant, the protesting Reformation, shook the very foundations of the church. And at the time, there were people who were not only excommunicated, there were people who were violently treated, burned at the stake. The stakes were high in trying to bring change to the church. And yet change it did. And we sit here today, those who have inherited that legacy of those who knew that in each age we are called by the Holy to respond to changing times by dreaming anew who God calls us to be, of reimagining and revisioning our purpose in a place, and what is the center of our ministry, and what is the call that Jesus continues to make on our lives. Well, I am delighted that Stockton Presbytery and Sacramento Presbytery, looking at changes that are happening around and within us, have decided to do a very specific kind of reforming, literally reforming from 2 presbyteries into one. Both of our presbyteries have been through a lot over the last decade or two. Both of our presbyteries saw beloved churches and pastors leave us, sometimes in very ugly battles, sometimes in things for which the wounds still remain, and yet God is calling us to a new day. We can't change that past, and instead God calls us into a new future. And so our 2 presbyteries are doing a bold and beautiful thing. With the synod meeting a week or 2 ago, synod approved the plan for merger that your presbytery and mine had agreed upon. And if you don't know the details of it, don't worry. That's all going to be coming out more and more over the next 6 months. But when General Assembly votes next June to approve this merger, on July 1, next summer, July 1, we will become one church together, one presbytery. I thank God for the new thing that God is doing. And though Sacramento Presbytery hired me, you inherited me, because I will also be your executive presbyter, your transitional presbyter. And my job is to be with you, to walk with you as we go through this season of change, that we might evermore be faithful to the one who calls us by name and fills us with vision of how we can serve the needs of the communities around us. Our new presbytery will be stronger than either one of our presbyteries were separately. What a gift. God is doing a new thing in our midst, and we get to be part of that. And so in coming months and years, I look forward to those from different parts of the Central Valley coming together for Bible study and worship and strengthening each other in our faith. Because these are, as our brother in the back mentioned today, these are challenging times. Some might want to say these are the worst times that have ever been. Now, I don't know if that's the case. But it does seem that every time we open the news or talk to a friend, there is more and more evidence of brokenness and weariness. And yet, even as the people the prophet Joel was speaking to, we too are reminded God will provide. God will give us what we need, and God invites us to be those of vision who listen to the holy and allow ourselves to be changed, allow ourselves to be reformed. Well, sometimes when we're going through change, our own sense of how things are supposed to be get in the way. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, but in the Gospel of Luke today, we saw a religious leader, a Pharisee, who was so certain of his faith, so certain of his righteousness, that he looked at others with disdain. He could not imagine that someone else had something to teach him about the gospel or had something to teach him about the way of God. He was a righteous religious man. He knew laws and proper behavior, and he knew cleanliness code, and he moved through the world, no doubt with great pride. Well, sometimes we in the church, even though we would not call ourselves to be Pharisees, we sometimes think we know how it's supposed to be. And it can make us resistant to change, and it can make us resistant to the very ones we need to listen to help us change. I think of that tax collector. Now, tax collectors, maybe we all grumble about paying taxes in this time, but in Jesus' time, the tax collectors were thought to be vile people. They were seen as manipulative and cheating. And Jesus, once again, as he so often does in the gospel, he takes someone who is the other, a person who was not acceptable in society, one who was not seen as a righteous pillar, to lift them up and remind us again and again of his ministry at the margins, where Jesus was not just saying to the righteous, "Oh, you just run with things the way you got them, boys." No, Jesus continued to challenge the structures that were stifling and unwilling to bend and change. In our time, we are called to be like that tax collector acknowledging our weakness and vulnerability, but also knowing that those other tax collectors around us, whoever we call the other, whether that is the homeless, the LGBTQ person, the family trying to come across the border. We do a lot of othering in our culture. We hear it on the news. We sometimes hear it from family members. I was just talking to someone the other day that said, I'm really hesitant to even go home at Thanksgiving because I know the conversations are going to be so volatile. But into such, we are called to bring a new spirit, a spirit that the servant leader Jesus modeled in his own life. Not seeking to build an institution, but seeking to create true community. Not telling people how to live, but modeling what it means to expand the circle so all are included. Jesus, the one who we are called to follow, who sought out again and again to engage not the mighty, but those who the world saw as lowly. Jesus, the one we are called to follow, who says, be a servant, humble yourself, but know that God will exalt you. What a powerful message, that in servanthood, in decentering ourselves from thinking it has to be the way that we imagine, we create more space within a church, within a community, within our lives for God's other voice to come to us, or God's voice to come to us through sometimes the most unlikely vessels. Brothers and sisters, as we gather on this Reformation Sunday, we are reminded that our own protesting beginnings led to part of our credo of being a church reformed, always reforming. And change is unsettling. Change, whether we have chosen it or not, can be unsettling. And yet we are called to be humble and curious and gentle and open and learn to listen in new ways, perhaps to those whose voices we have not listened to, and to trust that there is a future that God is crafting that we might not yet be able to envision, but we are helping to get to that place with the work of our hands and the love of our hearts. There's a story from years ago about a woman who was a master gardener. She had a beautiful, beautiful garden. And she had an assistant that came to her one day and said, "Oh, I have found the most amazing tree. It is beautiful. The leaves are just a beautiful green, lush color. The blossoms are so fragrant. And the fruit, it's just heavenly." And the woman said, "Oh, well, that sounds marvelous. We'll have to get that tree." And the assistant said, "Well, there's really no hurry because it takes 100 years for it to bloom." And the woman looked at him with great urgency and love and said, "Then let's plant one today." We are those who participate in a future we may not entirely see, but it's God's future, and it's a future into which each of us are being called in our strength and in our weakness, in our faith and in our questioning, in our humility, and in all the gifts we bring. God is doing a new thing. May we be bold and courageous in following the one who beckons us into that future with love and grace. Amen.